Welcome. We're
How you
small
doing,
crew today,
Rachel?
it looks
I
like.
see. I see.
We're just talking about the fact that Renee can't even find her box of unfinished things, much less sort through them yet. So,
I found,
what do you,
well, I have one.
ooh, you have
Um,
one?
yes.
Let me spotlight you.
Uh-oh. Can you see
Okay.
it?
Yeah.
And I'm hung up on the ends. I
Okay.
don't know how. I've been looking at a lot of YouTube videos of how they do the closings.
Yeah.
I just haven't, I'm not confident enough to do it, I guess.
So, so there's a few options on that style of chain.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I may even have some
And I
examples
wanted
I
to
can
show
show you
you.
simple.
Remember we
Yeah.
were
Yeah.
I
Oh, I'm
found
so
mine.
excited. You did it. You did it. Where did you get your ring?
I bought him a long time ago when I took his class.
Oh,
Long time.
that's awesome.
So I had extras.
Very cool. And you succeeded. Did
Yes.
you have any lessons learned?
Uh, it's been a little bit. Hmm. uh, no, because everything kind of worked out.
Good. It was
Yeah.
just you just did it slow and steady, right? You
Yeah.
didn't have to, you don't rush it. If you're not feeling it, you don't do it that day. Good
Mhm.
deal.
But I
That's
knocked it out.
awesome. And have you been showing it off to people?
No,
Ah.
no. And then I have another
So,
chain. This is another one. Can you see that?
okay. Yep, I can see that one.
And I
It looks like a pretty
definitely,
straightforward, heavy chain.
yeah. But I know a lot of people are saying just put a hook on it, but I don't feel like it's gonna be secure like that. I need like a
Yeah,
clip.
bracelet clasps are one of those things I talk a lot about in my class because there's so many of them out there that if you just lean wrong against something, they come undone.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them, like a
I
toggle
lost mine.
clasp. I love a good toggle clasp, but I don't like them for bracelets because they're going to come undone when you bang it the wrong way.
Oh,
Um, but yeah, so we'll talk about your wide bracelet in just a sec. I just want to make sure
okay.
that Renee, did you have anything that you do have on hand that you wanted to show, or is it all in the box that's unknown whereabouts?
Everything's unknown.
Okay, well then we'll help Stephanie on her challenges and see what we got and see if anybody else shows up. So one way, I don't know if you saw it before. Let me see if I can
Okay.
grab my example. One of the coolest bracelet
Go
is
ahead.
really handy. Um, hinge-based clasp like this. I'm going to bring this over to the good camera because I can zoom in.
You gotta make yourself the
Yep. Oh, that's
oh,
right. Thank you for reminding me. Come on. And then I'll make myself the person. There we
ooh.
go. Okay. Let me spotlight me, remove your spotlight. Hey, Nancy.
I see.
Good
Yes.
evening. Hello.
Hello.
Okay. So this is a great
Oh
style of
man.
clasp
Mm-hmm.
for a bracelet. It's designed really for those wide band things or for multiple strands of pearls. This one's done with square, but I would do your first one with round. It's a lot easier. And what it
Okay.
is it's a hinge-based pin that gets locked in place so it can't come out beyond that point. And then it's friction clasp, so it's held there by the pressure of the interior post, which is actually a split post.
Okay.
And then you can either do rivet through, or in this case, I put little eye hooks that I did into the frame before I did my little hollow there. Any
So
number
you
of
wouldn't
ways you can.
solder that into
Pardon?
the you wouldn't solder from that lock? You wouldn't solder that into the bracelet?
So that would make it really stiff and awkward at the end points. I would probably, you got a set of loops on yours, right? At
Yes.
each end. So
Uh-huh.
I would probably do a peg down through them.
Okay.
Or if you have sideways links, you can run a single wire all the way, peg all the way across.
On the
And then
okay.
solder that in place, right? And that holds it so it can
In
have some of that movement, that flex. Otherwise, you're going to get this thing that's really locked up and welded in. And then because it is a flexible bracelet, it'll
huh?
eventually wear out any solder points that you have inside because it's going to be
Oh,
bent. Whereas this has a little room to wiggle, so it's
good.
not really going to do that.
Okay.
So that's one option, and I have been working on, and this is you've given me a good segue. I've been working on a spring-based clasp based on some really half-finished notes I have of John's. This is you pinch together and it lifts out.
Look at,
So
I
there's a
have one,
spring.
but I don't know what I was doing with this one. I found this. Oh, I did push it in. Can you see it? But it's not coming
You're
out.
showing something? Hang on a sec. Let me share spotlight with you.
It's not coming out right this minute. You see it?
Yep.
I don't have a top to it.
You got, yeah, so yeah, that's this style.
Oh, it's coming out now. It did come out.
There you go.
Yeah, the spring little part in there.
Okay, so you must have taken a class with him where you actually got through it.
Yeah, I've taken plenty, like the majority of his classes. Yeah.
No, I mean, did you learn that one from John or from somebody else?
No, from John.
Yeah. So, and I just had the notes. I didn't ever get to take this one, I don't think.
Uh-huh.
So I was recreating it and trying because his notes on the handout for this one, so the copy I had at least was pretty limited in the details.
Yes.
But
I wish
that
he
would be a
finished his book.
fantastic.
Mm.
Pardon?
I said I wish he finished his book that he was
Yeah.
working on, the last one.
Yeah, you and me both. So that would be a great class for what you've just shown us on the bracelet. You would just end up either putting the little sheet
Right.
wire across. So you put one sheet on the inside tube rather, on the thick inside tube,
Oh, I see it
and
there.
run it
Okay.
all along. So, and then the other opposite it. Or you could put jump rings, a string of jump rings along it. The trick is you got to make sure it stays parallel so that this one's I need to file a little further down right now. It's a little wonky
Mm-hmm.
on how it rests. But if you ran it the whole length of the tube or most of the tube, then you could connect your pieces across on either side with just jump rings that you solder onto the connector points.
Yeah, I like
Right?
that first one.
So that's that's a second option. A third option is that you could do a multi-hook clasp, right? And so you would create a frame like on the first one I showed you. You'd still put something into the little box, and then off of the box, the connection would be a set of rings and a set of hooks, so that it's not just one hook holding it. So
Okay.
it's hook and eye mode like this by the time you got it done. And I tend to do odd numbers for that because it helps with if it tries to torque. So I would either
So the
do,
hooks are coming, they're opposite ends, right?
so let me draw this one because I'm not describing it well at all, I can tell. So hang on a sec. Back to the bench. So if you've got your little boxes that you've built out that you're sticking the stuff in, same as we did on the other class, the connection here is that you're going to put one set of, let's say, 3 hoops, and then you're on the other side, you're doing 3 eyes. I mean, 3 hooks and 3 hoops. So if we were to look at side on, we'd have the hoops and we'd have the hooks. And the act of having multiples makes it that much harder for it to disconnect. And one of the tricks you want is that you don't want your hooks below this line, right? You don't want a
Can't
hook
see it.
that
Can't
hangs
see it.
out down there, or else it'll get bumped out. Oh, sorry. Let me zoom back out. And I will redraw that.
What's locking it in place where it won't unlock?
So nothing is actively locking it in place. It's the act of having 3 different ones, and sometimes you can make it more likely to stay solid by making them at different lengths. So you might do this, for example, and then
Okay.
you'd have a shorter hook and a longer hook. And what that means is one act of getting it closed together doesn't easily unhook it. It would take a little torquing.
Mhm.
But the other important thing is make sure that your hook stays here, no lower than that line, because if it can be bumped against, or if it hangs lower, even worse, then you think about it, the wrist is going to bang against it and try to push it out of its hole. Another set of tricks you need on this one is whatever your bead is that's keeping it locked in, these should be just barely, I'm going to get a second color to show you, just barely able to fit through,
Okay.
right? So on a hook eye, you always want a very, very snug fit because that's part of what helps keep it from accidentally bouncing out. So
Okay.
if you're doing just the three equal ones, you know, have this, and then each bead would it could literally be one of those half drilled beads that we've got. You're going to have one that just squeaks inside of the space you have, and it has to have enough hook back. So a good hook eye is going to do basically that. And this gap right here should be whatever the thickness of this wire is that you're using as your hoop,
Mhm.
plus the tiniest little bit. So it should just barely have to go, almost click past the beads. And that means that by accident, if it bounces into that spot, it's not going to as easily
Come
unhook,
out. Okay.
right? So that's an easy combo because then you're just building your boxes and attaching the hooks and eyes to it. But it's much, much, much more stable than a single hook eye combination.
Okay.
Other variations that you can play with include adding some latches. So if you're really nervous about even the three-prong version and you've got, let me get this out of the way, you got your box and you got your hooks coming out, right? You could make a little hinge extra clasp that goes across and snaps in this closure clasp, which I'm going to draw a better picture than that. So there's a little tube, and then there's a bead on the opposite side that it acts as its stopper. And then there's a piece of wire that you've done basically a crisscross to, and it has to be snug and just sort of snaps in over that bead. And that's a pretty traditional secondary lock mechanism for almost any kind of clasp that as long as it doesn't move much. The reason I would probably not bother with this on a bracelet
Mhm.
of this style that you're talking about is there's so much flex that even that is going to get flexed a little bit, so it's likely to pop open. Not a terrible thing. You can also do one going each direction on the outside. It is it's like a oops, it opened up, the regular clasp opened up. Maybe there's a half a second where I notice it because it's still caught by its outside clasps. So you'll see it added to box clasps and things like that on a set of pearls or what have you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other ideas from folks on this one? So you want to show the chain again for the folks that have just shown up?
Oh, yes.
Gotta hold your hand behind it, I think, for us to really see it.
Okay. Let me take the filter off. I think.
Okay.
Background effects. Okay. So this is it. I'm holding it with one hand. So sorry.
Stephanie was looking for what kind of clasp she could do to this gorgeous chain she's
Okay.
made. Which is that fused loops that you're doing?
It's been a minute, so I don't remember.
Okay.
Yeah, they were fused. Fine silver.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Any other ideas on this one? What kind of clasp she could use? Okay. We got a quiet bunch today. Does anybody else have other? Oh, you said you had another chain you were looking at before we move on.
That was this one right here. Remember that?
Oh,
just
there we go. Got to bring it into focus for us. Nope, we're seeing mostly your mouth and nose right now.
okay. Sorry.
It's okay.
It's
There we
just
go. So a heavy link.
Yes.
Is there anything about it besides just being a very heavy link?
Nope. I was
Okay.
gonna probably put like a tag, some type of design attached to it when I decide how I'm gonna lock it. That's about it.
Nice. Okay. So I'm gonna confess on basic chains, I have a set of chains that I just do hammered textured links, and they're neck chains or bracelets. And I have a set of earrings that I do with it, although those are coming off of my collection for the most part. The what I'll do on a chain that's that straightforward is I put a high quality, heavy duty, fancy version of a regular spring clasp. So let me show you some of the versions that I have, if I can figure out where my clasps are hanging out right now. So I won't spend the time on a plain chain to make a clasp necessarily. I save that for my one of a kinds.
Mhm.
But there are some, these are mostly coming from Modern Toback. They have some really lovely heavy, heavy versions of traditional clasp. I think I gotta probably scooch in again. Go. Spotlight.
And they're thick. They're heavy.
Yeah, they're heavy and they're high quality. Like I don't usually like these kinds of clasps,
Real?
but one, they do some really, really cool shapes. Like I have a series of geometric chains that I use, and I have marquee that I can do. I have rectangle, so I can just put them in keeping with the style of links that I have. I don't think I have any other variations right now. Oh, they have some figure eights. This little heart one, as much as I hate hearts, is a kind of a cool version of the class. Here it opens. So this one is just all built in, right? So for a chain as straightforward as that, I might go spend some money on a good quality sprung hinge clasp.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean you have to do that. There's all kinds of other options. Like your toggle clasp that you just finished making. Like that unto itself becomes a pretty elegant addition.
Okay.
I mean, your knocker clasp that you just finished. Yeah.
Thank
Anything else you wanted to get feedback on?
No, not right now.
Okay. Nancy, Renee, you got anything?
Sadly, I haven't been in my shop, but I have a new dog. So
Okay.
that's life right now. It's like having a toddler. So, but
No
I was
worries.
say about that the circle chain. I
Yeah.
do like the idea of a toggle. And one thing I really like to do that's simple enough with the toggle is either wire a bead or a pearl or something onto the bar, or I like to set stones at the end of the bar. And that, you know, makes it snazzier without breaking the bank, so to speak.
I like that idea. Yeah.
It can also always be an unusual shape, or it can be the box clasp, you know? If you're gonna make the clasp, go all out. Here, I'll show a couple of the ones that are similar to what Nancy's describing that I have done in my demoing. If I can get them to untoggle. So little bit of bling on the ends. These are connected to themselves. They wouldn't normally be, obviously. But you can also do unusual shapes, although with a round, you may not want to. Again, we got a little sort of arrowy across the heart feel, little pink gemstones. But yeah, there's a lot of variations. I tend to use the fancier toggle clasps on my one-of-a-kind chain collection, where they're all being quite integrated into the style of the links that I'm using. But yeah, totally up to you. Anything else from anyone before we go to what else I've been working on? Okay, with a small group, we have quick time answers. So let me catch you all up a little bit. Just again, I don't know if everybody was on showing this. This is one of the things I've been playing with because I never did actually get to take this in John's class. And his notes are a little less detailed on his drawings for this one. But I had somebody ask me, "Don't you teach anything with springs?" And I realized I didn't. So this is spring loaded, 3 sizes of tubing that are nested. So it's a 4 millimeter into a 5 millimeter into a 6 millimeter in this case. Um, and it's mostly just fiddly on the cutting and filing that you have to do, is the way I would say it. Otherwise, it's fairly conceptually straightforward. And so I'm playing around with that to see what kind of variations I can make out of it, but I want to get basics down. And also, I need to find a better spring than I found because I ended up having to lock 2 short springs together to get enough springitude. But I really like the concept of it. And I want to come up with variations that are a little neater than this for what you connect to. I think I probably will only really enjoy this one if I have a full width of whatever's coming off of it. I don't really like the idea of it hanging out beyond the thing that it's attached to. So I
Where'd
gotta
you
play
find your
around.
springs?
I bought them on Amazon. They're just pen springs, basically.
Okay.
And there's all different sizes. So the ones that I'm using for this, I'll pull some out. They're just these. This set has rusted. This is my practice set that got a lot of pickle on it. But so fairly low key steel springs. Um, and if I
How
were
are
going
you,
to do it for, go ahead.
I was just going to say, how are you keeping them locked in the tube?
So the real issue is that the piece is longer than these springs allow for. So just the act of me having twisted them a little bit together and then stuffing them into the smaller tube gives the stopping point partway up the tube. So it just won't come up. There's no place for it to go. Oops, that's the unfinished one. There's no place for it to go, so it's just kind of stuffed together,
Okay.
right? And it won't come out by the nature of there's no place for it to end up. The one step that I haven't done on this yet is you lock the second tube so that it can't come out of the first tube. I think it may be far enough along to show that on my
Right.
second
That's what I
one.
was thinking. How do you keep?
Yeah, so what you do, here, I'll show the pieces. What you do is you have a notch in the inside smallest tube, and then once you've got your springs in place, but only after everything's polished and so on, so you're not putting your steel in the pickle, you put a little tab, you cut a little tab right there and push it into the slot above the spring so that the max it can do is that range.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yep. So that's one of the things I've been playing around with. And then, I don't know if I mentioned this on my last section, but I got accepted to a museum show, and it's I applied with 3 big pieces, thinking, oh, wouldn't it be cool if they pick one of my pieces, and they picked all 3 of my biggest pieces that I use at shows when I'm displaying as my attention getters at shows
Congratulations, though.
all year round. Yeah, I'm stoked about it, but I didn't know. I also didn't realize it was a 9 month long show running into 2026.
Whoa.
So I've been going a little crazy trying to get some replacement large scale pieces. And so the other thing I'm working on out of my box of unfinished things that you guys may have remembered seeing when we first started in the form of all of these little mock-ups that I did. So this piece actually started its life and made its way into my box of unfinished things about 2.5 years ago. While I was on vacation in Maine, when I don't have my gear with me, I bring some stones that really grab me, which in this case are these 3 Palmwood pieces that I have had for a few years. And so I just bring the stones that have been really appealing to me, but which I haven't actually done anything with, despite having had them for ages. Let me get this other one out. And I bring some of that foil that I've shown you guys on other sessions, and I just play. And I architect things because I can structure them, I can change their shape, I can get some dimensionality, I can even put some of the textures in that I want to emulate, so I can mock things up pretty successfully. and then I come home with a whole bunch of ideas. And this one had gotten as far as me making the tops and the sidewalls of a whole boatload of hollow forms. And that was as far as it got. I hadn't done my bezels, I hadn't backed them because I hadn't figured out yet how I was going to connect them. And so this week I've been working on the connections, moving them further out. And so this is in keeping with another piece I've done, which is using tiny little tubes and square jump rings between them so that I get a hinge effect. Now, I've talked to you all about what happens when we're trying to do a large scale piece and it goes up over the neck. You have to think about the directionality of your hinges. So these are all great and fine, but they don't have any forward back hinging. So I need to have a point about the shoulder where they start to hinge the other way. So what you're seeing here are all the sort of side to side hinge points. And I stopped working on this right at the point where I'm going to need to do my forward and back hinges. So the next ones will be hinging this way instead of this way. And I'll probably do that for the next two links and then revert back for the last one. It's going to have a chain at the back that goes in keeping with the shapes that I've got in the piece. I'll also mention that you'll notice this is hugely filthy. And that's actually on purpose. I do not pickle between rounds of working on the little hinges because as long as we're only cleaning up and filing the area that I'm going to be soldering to, it acts as a kind of resist that nothing else is going to flow and jam up if I overheat a little bit. So I work from this point out. And part of that is because I didn't know exactly where it would fall that I'd need to switch my hinge direction until I got there. I was actually predicting it was going to be right here that I needed to start. But I will show you how far this goes up the neck on me, and you'll see why I decided to go a little higher. So this is a pretty big neck piece, and it only just
Looks good.
starts to hit.
Are you
Say
putting
again?
color stone on it or anything?
It's gonna have it's gonna have some bamboo right there. I don't know if you guys can see it, but in each I've etched I've engraved a pattern that emulates the top of the palmwood that it's gonna have. That's not showing well. There we go. So the palmwood pattern is repeated in the metal, and right below that line or over the bottom line is where I'm going to do some bamboo work so that it'll be gold foil, picking up some of the color. Otherwise, I don't think at this point I'm going to put any other stones on it. I'm going to let the palmwood speak for the piece. And so it's going to go a little bit up and over, and then the last 6 inches or so will be a sizable length chain.
Jane,
That
looks
they
good.
can switch back and forth. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing
And
this
it's
one
still
done.
sitting flat around your
It
neck
is
area.
It is right now, but if I continued to do the same style of connection all the way up to the end, it would stick out like a little collar, like it would lift off the end. So these last few pieces need to have some downward bend before they get over the shoulder. And I thought this was going to hang a lot lower, but it's a little shorter overall. I was originally thinking it was going to be wrapped around and be a complete collar. But I realized that I don't think this piece will go that won't be that healthy and won't be able to be sized on a bunch of different people if I go that route because it's it splays out a little too much to be an easy fit if I don't have a little bit of chain at the back. So that's what I'm playing with. And then I also discovered my newest favorite rolling mill pattern, which I'll see if I can show you some of close up. I'm going to try it and see if I like it because I always am looking for new textures. And do I have a piece? There's a little piece that kind of will show it. So let me switch to this camera. See if I can get you guys in close enough to see. So it's this cool, it looks kind of
Like hammer.
bamboo-y.
Yeah,
Pardon?
I almost saw like a hammer, the shape of a hammer.
Oh, okay. It's getting these little diamondy shapes of different sizes, like sort of eyes that are high polished. And then it gets the lows get kind of a brick-like rough texture, and then I get patches of stuff. It takes better in some spots than in others. Um, but I like the backs of pieces to have some intrigue as well. And all it is when somebody does stuffing material that's the paper that they've just sliced, you just pull it a little bit apart and wrap it around your piece when you're rolling in the mill. And the
Cool.
differences in how the little triangle, the little diamonds land, anything that's the paper gets the sort of sandpaper finish, and all the openings get the high polish result. And this came to me for packing material on something recently, and I went, "Oh, I wonder what that will look like." David, it's much more interesting than rolling packing peanuts through your milk.
Would you, are you going to patina it afterwards in the back?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. When I'm going to have some patina once I put the Kimbu down and so on. And the sides are textured in my usual signature texturing that I do. And you can see it's going to be chained for about, oh, focus. Let me bring it back in focus. So it's going to come to about there. And then this is going to be chained with a little bit of extra if somebody wants it longer or shorter. So this connection and this connection are going to have to do this direction hinging. And I may even need to do a second one and then go back to the opening out, give a little more splay.
Would you be
Questions
able to
about
wear it-
those?
Would you be able to wear it reversible?
So I thought about doing this one that way, and realized that I wasn't going to get much of a different look out of the Palmwood, which I thought I should have debated. I was going to cut openings into the bezel. But the other thing that happens is if they're not all, well, yeah, I may still go for that. I've been on the fence because I love the back texture so much. Um, I just don't know if it's enough different than the front. I guess it will be all silver with no gold work. So maybe if they want to do an all silver necklace, I probably should. I've been off on it. But yeah, so the hollow forms, a lot of times I'll see if I can do a reversible piece. And then again, these connectors are quite literally tubing and then a jump ring. And the jump ring is actually the trickiest part, and I figured I'd show you some of the pieces that go into it. So, lots of boatload of these. So I've got to make the itty bitty little hinge parts, which I cut to size in batches. And then I put these in my flex shaft and file down and trim the corners, I mean, the outer edges. And then I put a burnisher just tucked inside and burnish the inside. The reason for that being is that there's a lot of back and forth action of the jump ring. And over time, if you have anything sharp, it can wear a gap in your jump ring, right? And it would fall apart at that point. So it's to give it a little more durability. You make sure you're nice and smooth and clean in each of the ends, outside and inside. And then the positioning on these has a lot of different variety. If you want a lot more control and fluidity out of it, you can put the tubing on top of these points instead of tucked into the side. I'm trying to make this one a little more subtle, so it sort of just seems to float between the pieces. But if you wanted to, you could put the tube hanging out up the top. It ends up with little Mickey Mouse ears on the tops of your pieces, right? So it's a different look. And having it on the top also means there's a limit to how much this can flex. Because right now I can flex almost straight up next to each other. Whereas if they're on top, it's going to be limited by where does it bang into the corner of the piece. Is that making sense? Sort of. Okay. And so then once I've got those soldered in, I use what I call a staple. Let me get a good size one. So I've sized the staples to the width that I want each one to be, right? Same width. And then I'm running it through my tubing as a U once they're soldered on. And then I have to fold it in on itself and clean and file it. And while it's in place, solder it closed. So the scary part is soldering it closed without melting your tubing or soldering into your tubing. And we will see that I worked a little too long on this on my final day of last working on it. And I've got two that are stuck. That one and that one I managed to fuse. So I'm going to have to desolder my tubing on those two and redo the full connections for each of them because I flowed my solder down into the tube itself and that locks it out. I don't make that call until after I've done a bunch of them, just because sometimes I've had it stuck because of the flux. And so I thought I only had one that was jammed up and that the other one was, if I go and put it in the pickle, it would clear up. But it's really, looked at them in daylight and they are actually both fused. So the moral of the story is when you think you're too tired to do something like this, you are too tired to do something like
Yeah,
this.
that is so intricate. I mean,
So
that
it is
is
and
a
it
lot
isn't.
of
And
fine
it's a
soldering.
lot of steps, but it's not as hard. It's one of the easier hinge mechanisms out there, right? Because it's only got the three parts. It's just, as with so much of this kind of work, it's order of operations. Any questions about that or anything else you want to see?
Okay, so you have a U-shaped staple. You
Yep.
feed it through your tubes, and then
My two
are
tubes.
you bending half of each arm to
Yes.
meet and then solder there?
Yes, I actually give myself extra material so that, and I make sure that one edge is shorter than, usually I make one edge shorter than the other on the assumption that it's going to be the midpoint.
Right.
And I've got it all cleanly filed. The other one I fold over and then I snip or saw to the
Okay.
fitting so that I
Yep.
have a clean fit and do a little touch up filing and then
Yep.
make sure they're pinched close together. And
Yep.
I do these, I don't do them boom, boom, boom all at once. I do a set and then the next set and then the next set. So what I was doing when I was putting these together is I was getting the left side and the next side and the next side. So I'd put three tubes on and I'd pause and I'd put a staple on and then I'd put three tubes on and I'd pause and I'd put a staple on, right? Because otherwise, if you get them out of whack, you don't know it so easily. And that was where I rushed and I tried to do these without realizing that I had locked the second to last combos up. But then also in this case, it's got enough complexity. It made sure that I was pulling the right pieces and putting them in the right place for this style.
Okay. That makes
So
sense.
yeah, you can do other than like you could do other shapes on the wire if you go wider. Like you could get this a little rounded, but in general, this I've found the square or rectangle is the most stabilizing in this particular style of hinge.
So what are you
Um,
gonna do now with the ones
what
that
I'm
fuse? Are you
what I'm
just
gonna do
gonna
is
start all over or what?
no. I'm just gonna fix those two. So I'll unsolder the two that froze, and then put new tubing on and put new rings on because I'm going to lose the rings in the course of trimming things out because they're
Mhm.
soldered into their little tubes. And then I'll work on the other direction hinge, which is simply the same act, except that it's going to go this direction instead of this direction, right? So all my
So,
tubes thus far run along this edge.
mhm.
And now they're going to, the set for going the other direction, they're going to run this way, bumped up against another one, so that these flex like that instead of like that. Yes, is that making sense? Show you this way. Not this, like all the rest of them are doing, but this. And what that allows is the bend that it needs to go comfortably over the shoulder instead of going, hey, I'm sticking out,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So that's one of the big things I've been working on because I didn't want to get too far on our in-house project that we're working through. And I wanted to walk you through some of the decisions I have made since last we met about the big project. Any other questions on this one before I put these away? Actually put those in a bag like the smart human being instead of this morning where I dropped them everywhere.
What gauge are you using for the actual, like, wire? The
For the
tube?
connectors on this one, it was 18 gauge wire.
Okay,
The
so it's
critical
thick.
thing is that's the thinnest I would go. That's the thinnest I would go on this weight of object. The
Mhm.
really critical thing on that is that just like with a rivet, you want it just fitting inside your tubing. You don't want it floating loose because the more it floats loose, the more it's going to bang against the edges of the tubing and either distort the tubing or start to wear away and eventually separate at that point. So it's a nice snug hinge fit. It is a hinge, so think of it the way that you would any other hinge, which is tightest possible fit you can make to still get the movement. Sometimes that includes drawing your wire down a little bit by hand, or in that gauge, you can actually do put it in a vise and pull it a little bit to stretch it ever so slightly thinner, like just the side of the 18 gauge you need. But yeah, get that fitted before you do it. And don't be like me. Make sure that you have checked that you have enough of the right size tubing before you start putting together a large necklace and you don't run out in the middle, which I did on the last time I did this style of hinge. So, any other questions on that one? Okay,
It's
now
a
we get
fabulous
to,
piece. I can't wait to
thank
see
you, I
it.
hope it will be. It's in that stage of ugly before it's pretty. So you always wonder. I think it will do.
Well, your
The
ugly
piece,
is different than my ugly.
the piece that it's replacing in my selection is the one that is on my signage and on a lot of my promotional material, which is the one I think I've shown it to you guys. It has all the bamboo and reticulation silver, and it has raw sapphires set on it, and my model wears it beautifully. But that's going to the museum show, so I figure this will be a good round two in a similar vein. So onward to our big project. Dun, dun, dun. When last we met, we had practice samples over there. We had done a trial run of our little hinges here with, where's my tube for that one? With the Alex Boyd style connector that we were playing around with and to see that it worked and it proved out. And then I went back to actually doing them for the project and realized I didn't like the scale. So let me show you what I have going on. So the first thing I did was make one, oops, I can't, gotta get out of my own way. Make one that was specific to the project. With the size of tubing I thought I wanted, so I could set a nice stone in there and scaled it. And the very first thing I did was I made one that was proportionally similar to what we had done in our example, and it stuck out way too far. So I trimmed it down to what I think is the minimum little tab that would work and still have stability in this particular style of connector, right? And so that came to this scale. And I was looking at it and going, ugh, look at how far that spreads them. And look at how tall that is. It looks like a chimney stack. So I said, well, maybe I'll like it better if I go with a shorter tube. So I did another one, trimmed down to a shorter tube. Okay, that's a little bit better, but it's still really breaking up the flow of the pieces. It's too big of a gap. I'm going to pull my camera over so you guys can see this a little bit more over the shoulder on that. So you see how much negative space it's creating here? When everything else that we've done has kept these pretty tight and close together and visually flowing, it was making me unhappy. So I said, okay, I was trying to do these to avoid regular hinges because this is a lot of regular hinges. And I ended up saying, well, I better see what it looks like with regular hinges. Get my hinge pin out. And then, of course, remember that we need to have bi-directional movement on this piece too, or else they will stick out and be really awkward. So I had to try one of each direction, and I had to give some thought to which combo. Do I want the flats going this way, or do I want them going this way? And naturally, with the size of a hinge that you need, it's a lot easier to do my flapping hinges on the flat pieces and my moving hinges on the corners. This, I can still put a little tiny gemstone on the top of each post, upright post. So every connector point instead of every corner connector instead of every piece could have one. Whereas my original design with these, I was thinking I was going to put one between every segment. But I really just didn't like the gapping that was going to be created by the scale. The proportion was off for me. So, as cool as I think these are, and as much as I'm going to absolutely be using them on something else, this ain't the project for it. So questions about that step-by-step design concept that I went through? And any opinions, you're welcome to share, even if you disagree with my decisions.
I don't know, it's such a strong piece, the way you've been, I mean, visually. So when you start to add the elevated piece, yeah, I agree with you in the sense that it does break it up, and then there's the space between. But I mean, if you did that to the opposite side as well, then it wouldn't be all of them. Maybe,
To the opposite side, I mean like this.
no, more towards to the hand, the other one.
Here,
No, no, that same size, but to the back, the second piece there.
here. Well, so it's an
Yeah.
all or nothing. I mean, I need the connectors for everything, right?
But
And as
couldn't you
soon as we
just like, I see it balanced where you can have it to the left and to the right, and then continue the way everything else is smaller.
But
It's
that's the
just,
problem. They can't all be smaller, right? It's
okay.
the minimum width of the mechanism is my problem, right? So I
Mhm.
even tried what happens if I just do the traditional style, and then I realized that it sort of just becomes busy work in the middle, whereas when I've got an actual hinge, I can put something decorative. I
Mhm.
can't put a decorative element on those connectors in between. So yeah, I mean, yes, you're right. There are things that I could do to balance it, but I think my objection to begin with was that it's spacing the big spaces too wide for my taste.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, that would be a good counterpoint is should I have done more of them before giving up on it to see if it was going to look better when it wasn't just on the small ones? And you're right, I probably would feel it less if I had started over here where I probably wouldn't be freaking out about it as much because there's a more proportional gapping. But I would have gotten really cranky if I'd done all the way around and gotten to the little ones and been like, ugh, that looks terrible. But
So what's your next decision then?
no next decision. This is now make a whole freaking boatload of hinges.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and again, I'm giving you my counter arguments from my brain. If you were doing a piece like this, absolutely go for it. Try one of these. Like there's nothing functionally wrong with it. I thought about could I scale the whole mechanism down by using a smaller tube and realized with the weight of these pieces, I was nervous that anything smaller than this would be too weak. It would take the torque too badly. I'm not worried about that with a more traditional hinge because these have a lot more strength in their connectors.
If you do the traditional,
Yep.
like where are you putting that hinge for that piece? Like right where yeah, right
Right
there.
here?
Yeah,
Oh,
where
it'll be a corner one. So all the corners will meet with this kind of hinge. right? See that little hinge in there that needs a lot of filing, but is there?
Okay,
Right? Three-part, yeah, three-knuckle hinge, and then
gotcha.
all the flats get this direction.
What gauge metal are you using for the hinges?
The hinges are actually tubing. It's heavy walled. I'll have to check the millimeter measurement on it.
Okay.
But yeah, they're tiny, but they're so close in that they don't
Mhm.
get a lot of torque. Unlike if we do this version, there's a lot more torque happening on those. Although, oh, I forgot to tell you about the other thing that I did while I was doing this. Remember, I was very frustrated that I couldn't get an easy, clean um, line straight across in our sample one when I was trying to do one and then the other. I was like, duh, I should be doing a single piece. And I cut a slot in my tubing and set the cross piece into it down the center. And I could choose to drill out the excess if I wanted to, or I can leave it there as a decorative element. Either way, it's a much stronger seam because it's soldered all the way through the tubing on both sides. So if I make these again for something of a similar project, I'll be doing that methodology. Is that showing, is this too tiny or do you need me to zoom in?
If you could zoom in.
So is that, yeah, it's a tube with a flange on it.
It's a tube with a flange, but the flange in the version that I've done since we did our trial, I put solder and did two separate pieces. On
Okay.
this one, I sliced down because I may even have one from my tile that I didn't. I have those still. I have too many projects out right now.
Mm.
Uh,
Well, something I was thinking, I basically agreed that where you were placing these tube flanges
Yeah.
closer to the front, it breaks it up in a way that isn't appealing.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if at some point you found at the back you needed more distance between the pieces because of the way they sit on the neck, then that does add like that little secret look at the back.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
It's
that is if it had
possible.
an advantage to giving you spacing you needed for how things sat.
I think that would twig out my OCD about consistency personally. Let me zoom back out a little bit. Oh no, we wanted to take a look at that cross piece. That's why I had it close. I can't find my little bag of partially prepped ones on this one, but again, I just made a mark across the tube at the halfway point. This one's not terribly perfect. Filed down, sawed and filed down enough for my cross piece, and centered the cross piece, fitting it tight. Oh, I keep going out of screen, don't I? Fitting it tightly into the notch I made, and then I solder from both sides, and it therefore flows to the inside of the tube as well. So this is a much more consequential, even if I drilled this out, much more consequential attachment of the flange than the surface solder that we got out of this, right? This is only soldered at the end, whereas the cut through, let me draw this one for you guys, because that would make this all much more obvious. So if I have my regular style and I've got this heavy wall tubing, all I'm doing for my solder point when I'm doing the regular kind is I'm getting
We can't
We
see you.
can't see.
I got this Zoom thing today,
Okay.
right? So my regular style, all I'm getting for a solder connection is what fills in here, right? But as soon as I put the cut in and go through, then what I'm getting for solder is this, this, and this, right? Ain't going nowhere. Even if I cut this stuff away, I still retain all of that soldering. So it's a double hold. It's stuffed down in there for extra strength. So on the tube itself, this comes down and it actually has solder running all the way in on the outside through the inside. So I've got all this solder surface I'm doing a very poor job of drawing my 3 dimensions today. Right? So the cut through version has solder basically on this huge patch on either side, holding it in place. Way stronger than when we do the basic version, in which they're simply here. Right?
And the piece that passes through is probably easier to solder because you can set the limit of depth and don't have to mess around with two little pieces.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
so you're measuring it by the depth of the cut that you make to create, because all I did was take my tube and take a notch out of it that ran, and it was also much easier to get lined up as a result. So my tubing was sort of ready for the passage. Crossed, right? And then when I slot the piece in, let's see if I can get this drawing in here. It's stuffed down in. All the way across and out the other side.
And
I
how does
really
it
wish I
stay
had
in?
John's drawing skills. Well, first of all, it's a
Stay
very
in.
tight fit. So I was actually hammering them down into their slot
Okay,
and then solder. But I
okay.
got a lot more solder coverage on this version because I've soldered, 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 soldered.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I left a little bit of overhang that I then filed away to get a fairly flat end on those. But this is like when I'm talking about this is why I said you guys aren't going to want to sit here and watch me do trial and error on it. This was probably 6 to 8 hours of me playing around making variations on this before deciding that I just didn't like that visual gap. And let me see if it shows better proportionally. I feel like I need to be up higher to show this to you better. Let's see. Oops, too far. So the proportions really sort of broke up for me when I got that big of a gap. But as you guys pointed out, it may not be that big of a gap when it's done further along where the pieces are bigger. I just wouldn't want to go back to, I think it was Nancy that was asking, would I do a single or one or two in the back for the special item? Visually, that will feel weird to me to have teeny tiny little hinges and then something bigger sticking up out of it. If I had a clasp mechanism in the back that broke it up, I might have a different connector to the clasp because then there's an existing break in the pattern. But visually, the importance of this one, the unusualness of it is that it has that full flow down to our ultimate clasp piece that is the evil that started this whole project. You remember when this was just a thing that was going on a fancy chain?
Mm-hmm.
Also, just I'll remind you guys that this is not the order in which I would normally be designing a piece of this scale. We're doing this sort of staggered design concept as we discover things about it, which is a cool exercise because it's making me really stop and think about why my choices are what they are. But I don't tend to go so far as to put a separate kind of connector on and then change my mind midstream. I usually am pretty confident about how I'm going to connect the pieces together as part of my design because I think about directionality. So another difference in if we went with this versus the little hinges is that our corners would necessarily need to be the this way hinging and our flats would be the this way hinging, right? So as with the style that I'm headed towards, I get this action and I get this action. But if I had the other style, I would reverse it, and what would happen is the pieces in between be doing this to open up on the changing neck size, and the pieces on the edges would be doing the folding. because I need the surface area of this to get the version of the hinge that goes the right direction. So that was another thing that was bothering me about the scale, is that it would change the flex movement. I couldn't easily get this direction hinge, sorry, this direction hinge on my corner pieces. So even something as small as that, as a change in the hinge mechanism, has a big impact to what we're doing visually and functionally on the piece. Right? The
Mhm.
act of changing my hinge style changes the direction of the folds.
What if you eliminated a set?
Making it overall smaller. I've
Smaller?
already gotten
Just
one
kicking
out of it.
Okay.
This is, believe it or not, even once once it's done, it's only about a 19-inch loop. With all of them. Let me make sure I'm saying that right, because I've been working on 2 different projects. So they're going to be closed. Be a little closer than it is. So with all of them connected together, it's presently, looks like it's an 18-inch, 18.5-inch right now loop, which is snug for a necklace of this scale. I actually contemplated putting another one in.
Yeah.
What else you got to throw my way on this one, gang? Besides deep disappointment at me for not doing the special hinges.
Hey, you can use it for something else, like you said.
Right. Yeah. I've already got
That's
several
always
other
fun.
pieces designed with that hinge because I love it so much.
Mhm. I think the
Anything
simpler
else?
it is, the better, in a sense.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd say teeny tiny knuckle hinges are simpler.
No, but just because the piece
Yeah,
is so strong, and
right.
what you're fighting with is the fact that the minute you put the larger piece, it changes the simplicity of the way it lays.
Yeah. And part of me knew that because I was still thinking about putting those stones up top and it was going to add bling to an otherwise pretty fancy piece. Um, I think it'll mean that I can trim down what I do for additional stones to just a couple of scattered, um, like gold bezel set in the reticulation, just a here and there sparkle that adds into it. As opposed to, I wouldn't have done those if I had one on each of those connector points. Um, so, yeah. So my intent was for demoing today, if you want to see it, is that we would work on the next set of hinges in the sequence, unless there's something else that you would like to see today.
It just sounds great.
Hinges, okay. All right, so we'll see if I can do this. I got my not my flu vax, but my pneumonia vax like yesterday, and it is kicking my left arm's butt. That sounds a little weird, I know, but it is like I got punched or hit with a baseball or something. So I'm hoping I have the physical manipulation skills I need for this. This is another one that I'm very careful to work my way down the string in order. I don't sort of skip around on it. I need to check because I missed filling one of these corners. And this piece is not ready for that. Can I go the other direction? We're going to fix the one that I don't like instead. That will be our go-to because then you'll get distance from take it apart in addition to the put it together. All right, so working this way, we're going to need an upright hinge. And there's slightly different heights between my reticulation piece and my non-reticulation piece, which is okay because I'm going based off of where I position the total collection of hinge pins. I just have to be careful that if there's considerable height difference, none of the knuckles don't touch the shorter of the pieces. lot of negatives. Let me draw that so that I can show you what I mean. And also, I'm going to close my windows because we've got into the darkness. Okay, pencils. All right, so I have one corner here, curvy shape right there, and I've got another corner here. And these are the two that are going to meet, but if this one is a little shorter than its neighbor, what's important is that of my three knuckles, none of them hang out above that mark of the lower one, right? I have to have at least half of my upper hinge low enough that it's got bump against the other, or else it becomes useless as a support system on the other side. So what I did was I figured out my total measurement of the shorter piece and then roughed in my size of hinge of knuckles based on that. And I say roughed in because it's too tiny of a piece for me to get exact precision on each of them without going insane. And frankly, trying to cut teeny tiny pieces, I'm going to need to be cutting them in this. So conveniently, my smallest knuckle is whatever this size was when it was completely closed. It's actually a little smidge too big, but it's easier to file excess away once you've got the knuckles soldered than it is to try and get your exact match beforehand. I have a little bag that I have cut of all of these pieces. Where is it? There we go. Right, no. That's the other bag. Where are those pieces? I very carefully brought them out and put them aside so that I would have them for you. Oh dear. Let's see. Give me a sec, gang. I gotta go dig on. We've got too many examples for us today. Yes. That's 4 minutes ago. Does that bode well? Maybe it's a scene file for a little bit before we start. I mean, stop for a little. Start. It's the right size. Okay, so first step for these itty bitty pieces is I'm going to be sawing out a couple of them, which I swear I have like 30 of them that I cut this weekend so that I would be ready for this. I don't know where they are. That's annoying. So I'm just doing the best I can to keep these nice and clean. And then gathering a pile of them. And when they're this tiny, I have a very hard time holding them to do the cleanup. So if any of you have a preferred method of holding itty bitty parts for touch up sanding and so on, I would love to hear it. Have a favorite tool when we're talking about tiny little bits of
What are you currently using? Anything?
I'm literally using my fingers because they're so small that I can't hold them in anything without them going and flying elsewhere.
Have you tried shoving a toothpick or something in them?
Just to sort of hold them
Yeah.
upright.
Yeah, because
Sure.
you can always file away at the wood. Or
Yeah, toothpicks. I can see if that can work. I'll do that this minute if you want to. By the way, whenever I'm doing hinges, I'm always cutting at least 1 or 2 spares of the tubes because even if you're using heavy wall tubing, it is going to be fair certainty that you're going to melt out one of the knuckles as you go. So if you have spares, you won't melt them, but if you don't have spares, it's guaranteed you will. That's the rule of tiny parts. Or it'll roll off the bench and you'll lose it, or number of things.
or you'll have
Uh,
30 of them cut and you don't know where they are.
which is freaky to me. I literally, it was the last thing I did before I turned on my equipment for you guys today, is I pulled the bag and I set it next to the project here. So I'm betting I managed to knock it down on the ground as a bag. I'm just not seeing it.
You'll find it after we're done.
Pretty much.
Because that's
Moments.
the rule.
It is. Because I swear, I don't enjoy making you guys watch me saw, especially since I'm invariably sawing in poses that I would not normally saw in order for you guys to watch me saw. So it's not good habits I'm showing you. There we go. We got 5. Theoretically all the same size because I used my little jig in practice. The jig, especially when you're at the back end, is a little iffy on how clean it is. So toothpicks, you say? These are my box of everyday toothpicks is. Oh, promising. What a great idea. I love it. Yeah, brilliant. So I'm just taking the chatter that comes from the saw, from the active sawing, off the edges on this one. I am not worrying too much about the interiors on this one because they're going to get burnished by us finishing them up at the end. Unlike the ones that I had to solder my pin through, my staple through on the other tubes. So this is really just make it so that it has a good surface to attach when I'm soldering. And so hinges, you could do a whole book on hinges, and I think Charles Luton Brain may have, if I recall correctly, just on the ways that people do hinges. My strong recommendation to you, if you like hinge-based projects or think you might, is to take every possible hinge class you can under the sun. So many different ways to go about it, and so different by instructor, different materials that people use to help make it easier to solder. And it's a practice thing. So my technique, I'm going to tell you, is one of the least good ways for somebody new to hinges to do it. Mine has come about from becoming more experienced with soldering and being more comfortable with repairing if I do something wrong, which is a frustrating approach for a beginner to hinges. But I'm going to talk about some of the alternatives that people use that are better for when you're working hinges. So we've got our set of pieces here, and now we need a little nest in which these are going to rest, because we're working with the round of tubing. Our choices are somewhat limited. One choice is we can cut a piece of or file a bit of the tubing off and make a flatter surface on one side that we can attach to our piece. Perfectly legit, as long as you do it consistently to all of your tubes And that includes the one that's going to hinge the knuckle on the other side. Because if you make this too short and your knuckle on the other side is still fully round, it's going to butt out and it's going to be hard to get your pin to run through both of them, right? So it's not a method I do very often. I do it for very specific situations, usually on a box lid that I'm trying to get to look a certain way, especially if I'm working on a curved box lid or something. So mostly I'm going to keep it as round as I expect it to be, but that means I always need my two colors. That means that whatever I'm currently soldering it to only touches down at this little spot here. Not a terribly solid connection for something that takes a lot of pressure. So on the hinges, and on the flat side, I'm going to actually make a little space for it to fit into. And I'm doing that by running a channel along the whole of the length of the tube that I'm going to be resting in there. There are even some tubes, some settings that are done as nested hinges, where you take a nesting set of tubes and you will make a literal nest out of the larger tube, right? So this runs, you create a little cradle, it's called, and then your inner tubing is designed to snugly fit inside of that. And so rather than soldering to your main piece, you're soldering to the cradle, the two links on one side. Right? That's going to be one of them. That's going to be the other of them. And then your other one will fit perfectly when it slots in because it's going to have a happy little cradle that's the only place it can fit. So this is a full-on cradle, which is usually half of the diameter of the tube. And then this is just a give it enough space so that when we solder in, we've got some decent coverage of where we're soldering it in, so it's more solid. Questions on that?
It occurs to me that if you did want to do the flat on the tube, then before you cut it into the little pieces, you could file your flat and then hopefully get it level.
Yeah, it's a little trickier even than that, because if you think about it, the one that's going to be moving into position against the flat is going to be changing where the flat hits. So you have to actually sort of take it down a little bit more than you would around the exterior. Otherwise, it kind of goes clunk, 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 clunk when it hits the round. It's tricky. It's one that I try to avoid. It's better for box. So on a box, we're going to have our hinge opening a device, meaning like if I'm not sure I'm going to be able to draw this one today because I wasn't in the box making mindset, but I've got two pieces that are sharing a hinge. They're going to lift up and it's not banging against something on the other side, so that because it's on the exterior, the squaring off isn't as big a deal because it's opening like that, whereas these are moving between two pieces. Look at a door hinge at some point, a good old-fashioned traditional door hinge, and think about where it would stop the door if there were or weren't walls around it, if it's just what it's attached to. And like just sit in there and your family will think you're a little nuts, but watch the movement of it. And if you want to even take like a marker or something or a piece of tape and put it where you think the stop point is on the hinge loop, and think about whether if that were squared up, would it start to catch in a different position. Like this is the kind of thing where you go to hardware stores and look at hinges with an eye towards how would that work if it were on a necklace? How would it work if it were on a pendant? Like one of the easiest hinges to practice on is a connector between two pieces of two pendant components, right? So we've got component one and component two. Make yourself a hinge that is between them. This is a nice basic hinge because it has almost 360-degree rotation if you need it to. It's really just a flappy point. As soon as you start putting other constrictions on the hinge, then you run into limits where that squaring can get in the way or not. I think I've rambled enough about that. I hope it's got you at least
No,
thinking about.
it's actually a great comparison
Okay.
and a good way to look at it.
Yeah.
My husband happens to be a carpenter, and so as far as figuring out how door hinges work, what you're saying makes sense when you think of it in that bigger picture. So
Yeah.
I think that's good.
Good. And just don't be freaked out when you go to the hardware store and you come across the double action hinges where it opens part way one way and part way the other way. Like look at a swinging door at a bar. There's some amazing things that if your mechanism is right, it makes your movement very different. And if your positioning of the knuckles is wrong, it can jam it up. So start with simple. And this is a great project right here for you. If you've never done hinges, two pieces of a pendant or hollow form and a hollow form or a bevel setting and a hollow form or something like that. And just a straight up, you're putting a hinge. But if we look at this from the side, so that we've got, let's say it's a cabochon down here and a nice hollow form up here, right? Even still, I'm going to want to say, where is my cradle? What is holding this in before I start the hinge? And it could be an actual cradle you've made, or it could be you just make your material thick enough that you can grind down into it. And that's what we're about to do. We're going to grind into the corners of two of my hollow forms. Well, we're going to do that after I take off the not using them part. First, I have to go over and remove the ones I've decided I'm not doing. Okay. To flex again, even though I'm taking this off, but sometimes it gets a little cleaner. One of my challenges is, besides the direction of the first this afternoon, is that I keep the vision silver on the top of my hollow form. The teeny tiny bit of the highlight to melt. So the most common thing that will happen is after the Foster silver copper blend bleeding out the edge of the piece. That is a really bright glare. Is that better? You guys see? It looks like you might not be able to see what I'm actually doing with the bench. How's that? You guys see?
Your voice is a little garbled.
So this was the thing with the problem with my mic being bad.
It's better now.
Yeah, because I'm getting closer to the mic we're using. Hang on, let me see if I can turn on the other mic and see if I can get the fuzzy mic doing its thing. And tell me if you're still hearing me. Tell me when you stop hearing me.
Still hear you. Don't hear you.
We lost you.
Yeah. So this
Okay,
one,
now we hear you.
yeah, but this is the one that's going to be harder for me to get to. So, let me see if I can. I'm just going to turn my mic a little bit more towards where I'm working and see if you guys can still hear me when I move over to here. Can you hear me? Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, you can. Okay, just a little muffled.
Yes.
Okay, let's try to be enunciating like in my theater days. What I was saying is that The reticulation of silver on the top of this is the risk, because it sometimes wants to ooze either the solder or the material that's the copper mix from out of the reticulation of silver while I'm working. See what happens. Cool. And then we'll do some grinding. So, I don't know if you saw, but I was getting an ever so slight bit of ooze on the first piece with the reticulation silver as I did that first one. The trick is hot and fast, right? I went in with a fairly high torch, very focused. You could also go down to a smaller torch tip to get a like really, this is where I'm aiming kind of thing. But really it's about getting as fast as you can and get back out. And I had the tweezers at the ready, but I'm not actually hanging on to the piece I'm removing because the steel will steal my heat. So I risk it crumbling. That happens a lot when you're doing a recovery like that, is whatever the piece is you're grabbing, just shatters, right? Don't be freaked out. It's the change in temperature between the too near heated steel and the silver itself. It gets a shock and it crushes, and just put it in your scrap pile for recycling. So we're just gonna, and there's some solder there, so I need to clean it up no matter what. I don't need to repickle it and everything. All I really need is to get the surface that I'm going to resolder to clean. In the meantime, I'm going to look at my set of 3 pieces. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a stack of 3 to make my hinge. And this is a bit taller than my short pieces. I'll get a short one. Right? So a little tiny bit. Get in the zoom for you guys. Put it somewhere that we can actually show you. And yes. So I've got my set of 3. I could file them all down a smidge and be happy with it, but I'm also doing okay with this because I've got that coverage down at the bottom. So it still hits. It doesn't, it's not above the piece that's the short one. So some of the thing, I'm going to talk while I'm waiting for those other ones to cool. Some of the things that people do that help make hinge connection easier is they will make it out of a single tube instead of cutting the 3 segments, and cut away the middle section and saw it out basically. So you're soldering your 2 ends, your 2 outer knuckles, and then you cut away and you waste the middle tubing, but then you have a perfectly lined up, you know it's going to work kind of line. That's perfectly acceptable. Sometimes people will do that with a half cutaway, meaning in order to know where their other knuckle is going to go, they're gonna have cut down the middle partway through the piece. So let me actually draw that one. That was a little harder the way I'm describing it. Zoom back out. I'm doing a lot of wobbly on you guys today. So if you take a whole tube, the length of what you want for a final hinge, you can cut away that. So you have just enough to keep it in place, right? And then what you're doing, this is the part that you're leaving behind. This is what you're soldering to. So you don't ever solder down accidentally the far side of what's going to be the middle hinge. This is just a thing to hold it in place. Super cool way to do it, especially if you got some really precise setup that you need to do. And so then we're putting our solder here and here. And then next step is we cut away so that we have our two perfectly positioned pieces. And then we build the other side to fit exactly what we want. And we can solder this side over onto our other piece, right? Great way to do it. Some other things that people do, they'll take graphite pencil lead and line up the set of three. I'm going to be talking in threes. Just know that every hinge you do of this style of hinge must have an odd number of knuckles. You could do 7, you could do 11, but they got to be odd numbers because the strength of its support is that it is locked in on the two outside edges, right? If we had a fourth and we were rotating the hinge, this end could lift up and this end could lift down. So they torque relative to each other. By having the outer ends the same side and locking them in place, we're getting a hold. And this is the one that does all the work of moving. Is that clear? Anybody
Yeah.
ever tried making, yeah? Question?
That's the way I only know how to do hinges.
Is with
Tube, and
multiples of odd?
With
Good.
what you explained, where you saw
Yeah.
the middle part and you solder it
Great.
to one.
That's a perfectly legit way to do it. It's just some people, like if you're working in gold and making hinges, that's a lot of remelting and some really expensive tubing, time-consuming tubing if you're pulling it yourself. So you don't need to work that way if you don't want to. Now, one of the benefits of that version is you get very, very clean fits, which is great. So some of the other things that they're doing is they're running piles of pencil lead through enough that stuffs the thing and keeps all three of them in place. Me, I go out on the edge. I live dangerously. When I can, I'm actually doing an offset positioning of my three, and that's what you're going to see me do today. So I go part way in to this. I'm going to do one side at a time. So I'm still going to do this solder first, and then I'm going to do this solder. But while I'm setting this one up, I just leave that tube hanging out a step back so that it's kind of holding its place. Get these soldered down, and then I can solder this one down. And worst case is I have a little bit of cleanup filing that I have to do to line them up a little bit better. But I know that they fit their width. So that's my preferred method. I don't use whiteout. I don't use yellow ochre. You can't pay me enough to use yellow ochre. If I did, I would use the waterproof, the water-based whiteout. You don't want to use the other version of whiteout because that's really, really toxic. And you want your whiteout to dry. So if you're trying to use a resist because you're having trouble, no judgment. Resists are an amazing thing. Some other resists you can use, natural resist, which is the reason I left that other piece we were looking at all blackened, right? It acts as a resist. Oxidation acts as a resist. So you can actually force that. If you use an acetylene torch, you can put your fingers over the air holes on your acetylene torch, and it will put that black char that we all know is happening, but we try to not think about. It'll heavy duty the black char onto your piece, and it acts as a natural resist, right? So I could take this knuckle and blacken the heck out of it so that there's no way my solder is supposed to flow to it. It doesn't last for terribly long, but it's on par with using the whiteout or the yellow ochre. All very legit ways to go about it. And the pencil lead is also a resist, as long as you're using the real stuff, not you don't want to use lead. Um, and because what it does is it acts again as a carbon-based something in there. There are even carbon rods you can get. You may have used one for stirring if you've done any smelting of metal. Sometimes you can get the right one sized for what runs through your tube. All good ways to line things up. Again, what you're going to see me do today is a little more casual than that. Any questions about any of those variations on the theme? And if you're already doing three knuckle hinges and you haven't done a 5, I would encourage you to try it. It's a whole experience. And it's worth knowing if you like to do large object work. So we have our 2 little knuckles, and there's a whole lot of solder left over. So the first thing I'm going to do is a little grinding down of that extra solder. Sure, I have the right bit. Here we go. Going forward, I've been working in reverse for a while. Thankfully, the cleanup just puts me back to my normal texture that I like. But I've got my seams a lot more because I have been heating it a few times, so I have to be cautious. And you see there's some spillage of the edge of the weakest point for me on this is that the reticulation silver melts so much lower temp than everything else that it wants to go and flow. So I'm making sure that I have a fairly flat corner to work with on each side, and that it's relatively clear of the interfering solder that could risk flowing things. And now I'm going to actually put back in that divot that I want. The divot can start with any number of steps. You could use a triangle file, if I know where my triangle file is. You can, if you're steady-handed, you can go straight to a round file, but I find I need a little bit of a gouge in order to grip, especially when I am on corner like this. And I'll do my triangle file. There we go. You guys still have good audio for me? Anybody there?
Yeah. That's
Okay.
good. Thanks.
Okay, good. So I'm taking the triangle file. You could also start with a small mark like we've done in some of the strings and anything that I've shown. Right now, I'm just trying to get a good starting mark right in the corner. I'm in about not even a full millimeter. And again, I go back and forth because I never do file precisely all in one direction. Once I've got that notched, I'm just going to start building the feet for the tubing. And this one I find is small enough that I need to be careful about how much of my file I actually use for this. I just need a bite of channel so that I get more solder flowed beneath the knuckles. Always have to remind myself slow and steady, because I tend to want to go zigzagging into my filing. It's not neat enough. If you have a Chenier file, is that one with just the edge? Those are designed for hinges. It's also called a hinge file. Surprise, surprise. And that can also be used. Let me see if I have one of these on the side to show you that. Let's show you here. Not that squirrel. But they're designed specifically for getting the hinges into the tight spots. There you go. So there's only filing surface here and here, and not on the flat on either side. So, and there's usually on a good one, there's going to be a slightly less exaggerated curve on one and a more exaggerated curve on the other. So I can take my Chenier file and run it straight down my little notch, and it does a really super job of creating that channel for me. The problem is they don't make them in a lot of different sizes, so it only gets so far, which is why I tend to go towards the round. Right. Here's another example of the blobbing that I'm getting. That's a lot of blobbing. Right, so now I'm going to do the opposite corner that's going to meet up with it. These are going to meet here and here. Triangle. You gotta watch out. The thing I always forget is not to twist when I have a hinge on the other side. It's really easy to forget you've got knuckles nicely placed. It's not a bad call to get out a square and mark your line. These are so abstract already that I'm eyeballing it. Use better habits than I have, is what I'll tell you. Those opposite hinges. Again, this is not like a full-on cradle. This is really just to get us quality surface area for soldering, for the strength of our hinge connection. The bigger and more physical the movement of the hinge is, the more important having a really, really solid cradle is, because you need that grip from the extra soldering. If you've done it enough, your little tiny knuckles should successfully sit in the notch and not roll off. This one may not be deep enough, but we're going to test it and see. Knuckle. Right? So, and they'll be lined up better when we're positioning them. But what I need is that connection that tells me that I'm not just touching down at the curve of the piece. So I'm going to take these over. Oops, I got to test my other one, make sure that I've actually got even better. I need. Right, and then a subtlety of the methodology when I am doing multiple strung together ones. Let me get my other series. Is that I tend to want to have, I don't want to have a 2 on both sides. I want to have a 2 and a 1. Of course, I failed to do that on this one. We're going to maybe keep the pattern I've got, but I tend to not want to put the torque directionality of both hinges if I'm connecting multiple pieces together all on one piece. So, except that I screwed it up on this one and did a 1 on both of them, I would probably want to go, because I have a 2 here, I'd want a 1 here. But I've already started with doing the 1s, so with doing the 2s on the opposite side, so we're going to continue with our 2s. So this side's going to get 2 and this side's going to get 1. And stack of extras. So here is the 2 and 1 all ready to go. All right, back over to set up our soldering. Why am I getting so much burn? Is that glaring too much for you guys? It looks to me like it's pretty glary.
It is.
It is very glaring. Better? Less glare? I'm taking silence as we're okay. All right. So, this is the operate hinge that we're doing here. I'm going to take my 3 favorite little pieces of the many that I have cut. On this side, I'm looking for a very flat surface. And then I'm stacking offset my middle. And I think make sure that they're well stacked on top of each other.
So is the tube covering the whole depth of the piece?
More than on this one. So this one is because of this, because of the scale I was working at. I'm gonna actually do this on its side, it'll be easier. Because of the scale I'm working at with the minimum size to cut in my tube cutter, these are hanging over by a tiny, tiny amount that I'm gonna file down
Okay.
once I'm in place. So I'm gonna actually do a little bit different position for this one. I forgot that I did use the first one on my side. Because I can actually get a more straight line if I'm working my way down. So I'm going to put all 3 together. Should have this one so that it's set. Doesn't hurt to have a piece of wire that you can string through these.
Did you put the lead between all the tubes, or at least the 1 and 2, and then not the other?
Yeah, so that's part of why people use the lead is you can put a little offset by having some running behind it and some right in front of it. And I'm not sure that well. I could run the offset, I can run a couple through to hold the offset, and then I can run the rest through to stop the 2 outer knuckles. Because it's, it's like putting a bundle of spaghetti in there. I'm just gonna repeat. Very shallow groove. We'll keep these pieces from rolling around too much.
Your voice is kind of wobbly.
Sorry, I'm grinding a little channel into the brick to kind of position them better. And then I'm gonna have to dig a little offset to pull the middle one out.
How about
And my
pins?
hands are shaking today. Say again?
I can see you have a pin there. Would you use a pin to hold it in
This,
place?
you could, except that remember, I want an offset. I can use a pin to at least get them started. That's not a bad
Okay.
call.
Okay.
But I need this, the way that I'm working, I need the middle one offset by a smidge. It's confusing to do.
It's a lot of propping.
Pardon?
It's a lot of propping.
Yeah. The outside two bumped up against with a teeny tiny offset. You guys see how little I moved it out? Just enough that I can keep it from soldering to the back wall. Oops, don't move them. I am going to be pick something with medium. And I'm going to, before I touch even so much as a hint of my pick down, I'm going to count on the flux acting as a bit of glue to help keep those in place. But I need just enough to make sure that they're locked in. And did not get locked in. Flux. That being one of the challenges, when something catches it, it wants to get back in place. Because once I've got them set, I want to go fairly quickly in and out. And I always want to put my blobs of solder plentiful, but towards the outside of the hinge knuckle. And I'm not sure I have this ability today, but we'll keep trying. So again, I try to put my solder on the outside. So that when it flows, it's less likely to flow in towards the knuckle that I don't want attached. Yep, that's going completely in the wrong direction. Moving the other one out. Yep. Too soon. Guys, I do not have the control I need today. I'm not going to get these hinges. Too wiggly. I just managed to melt the middle two completely. My hands are too wobbly today.
Tiny little tube. Oh my God.
Say again. What was that?
I was just commenting, a tiny little tube soldering onto that big piece.
Yeah, so again, the trick, so it's heavy wall tubing, that's important. If it's thin wall tubing, you'll be melting them all over the place, but also it's not as durable for a hinge. And it's really about getting in quickly. And I couldn't get the control enough to get there today. So whatever the reaction to the vax is getting, it got me really wobbly. So I apologize that I can't give that demo, but it's what we'll pick up with. I'll leave some for the next time. And it's really about it takes a lot of time to get it set up. Spend your time on the setup and the solder part will flow easily if you're not wobbly on that. And otherwise, again, you may find that having the partial tubing works better for you and then cutting away, which would be an easy way. That would actually be a way to get because these are so small, it would be a much easier way for me to get the position. And despite being stubborn about the way that I usually do it, I may go back and try that on some of these and see if it improves things. It certainly will improve the positioning for sure. But use whatever props you need. Use pins, you saw me using nickels to sort of support it. You can even, if you need to, go in and do one knuckle at a time. It's just a lot more risky for the second solder flow on that one. And it's a little harder to position because you'll find that sometimes you flow the other one just enough that it moves out. So I always try, if I can, to get it on the first everything soldered together pass. Trying to think what else I can give you to help with hinges in the meantime. Oh, and I forgot to mention at the beginning that next month's session, because I'll be traveling for a show, is going to be the second Wednesday. I'll give you guys the dates as we wrap.
Okay, Wednesday.
Yeah, pardon for not having a better demo for you today.
That was wonderful.
It
I
doesn't
mean,
feel like
you're
it, but I
such an
don't.
amazing artist that you don't realize how amazing you are.
Okay. It's more about making sure you guys get something out of each session. So I hope that there was
Well,
We do.
enough of the
We
end
do.
stuff. Okay. Any external questions? Anything related either to this project or to other projects or your own projects that you have questions on or would like feedback on? You know,
well,
Carmen is in
I have a
warm
question
Mexico.
about the tubes. Are
Sure.
you still using hard solder?
No, I'm not on this one because, and for two reasons. So if I were soldering to something that I hadn't done a lot of other soldering on, I could absolutely use hard solder. I prefer it, and I actually find in tight spaces it flows cleaner. So let me talk for a few moments about solder, and I think I've given you parts of this speech before. The difference between hard, medium, and easy solder is the other materials in it, the other than silver materials. The more of those other materials, the more it will reflow. Like, so easy solder will reflow multiple times, but it's also what I would describe as muddier, meaning even when it flows, it's kind of like gluggy, it's thick, the flow on easy solder versus the flow on a hard. Hard is a clean, crisp flow. You just can't make it flow a lot of times. It gets gluggier the further you go. Whereas easy has that coppery kind of sludge action. So what that means is if you can get in and out really quickly, like chip solder is great for hinges because you can position it and you can even make that part of your positioning routine. For me, I'm just more of a pick solder gal, but you could position it cold. You know, you go in, you flux in order to get everything stuck in place, you cool it off and you use tweezers and position little chips of hard solder behind your hinges. By all means, take the time to do it that way if that gets you your precision clean touchdown. Um, if you're going with hard solder and you go in fast, you're going to get that flow and it'll be clean and quick and it'll be a really nice hinge connection. If you go in with something more sluggish, like an easy, you're going to have a lot of cleanup. It's going to be grumbly when it flows. So you kind of, if you can get in fast enough, if you can use a mini tip instead of a big tip or whatever, if you've got an oxyacetylene, all of those will flow faster if you go with hard than you think they would. It's not just literally that hard takes longer to flow, it's a combination of factors. That said, if in this case I had other factors, I have a hollow form, which creates a problem of pocketing for itself, and it's a hollow form that's capped with reticulation silver, which is an extra big problem because it wants to ooze like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich out the edges, right? And there's a lot of extra solder holding the top on because of the ebbs and flows of it. So all of those things mean I'm using medium solder on this. And if I were in real dire straits, I could go to easy, but I would hate the color that it would provide. So it I know that especially when none of you guys are early on in your soldering career, but when you're early on in your soldering career, you want an A, B answer. I either do this or I do that. There's so many factors that go into what makes a good solder by the time you're done, that you have to sort of use your best judgment for it. Doesn't hurt to use medium. Doesn't even hurt to use easy, except that it leaves you more yellow staining around your hinge. So
How about medium? Does medium give you the same kind of color that easy does? Or is
not
it-
as bad. It's staggered. It's the greater amount of copper and other material, zinc or whatever they use,
Okay.
that depending on the solder brand, that are leaving that stain that you get there. You'll even see on your hollow forms, like if you do hollow forms the way that I show, medium solder, when you're putting your tops and bottoms on, you'll see sometimes that you get yellowing at the seam lines, right?
Mhm.
Just tiny hints of it. Um, so yeah, it's gonna depend. But if you can go with it, I know jewelers that will only work with hard solder, or there's something called IT, which is even closer to pure silver. That's used by people who are doing enameling and so on, because it doesn't have the other things that keep enamel from sticking. And so people will either use IT and then hard, or they'll just be everything has to be done with hard. And they just use it for each thing and get so good at soldering that they don't unflow the solder seams they've done before. Because remember, solder, every time you flow it, a little bit of the material that causes it to flow burns off.
Mhm.
So you
Mhm.
have microseconds more the next time than you did the first time you flowed it. So,
Mhm.
other questions
And
about
IT, do you use it
IT?
the
Is
same way?
it's a eutectic solder is what it's called. I can't remember what IT actually stands for, but I think it's some other way of saying eutectic. And it doesn't have any, it's not zinc, whatever the other element besides copper and silver that goes into most solders. It doesn't have that, which is the thing that keeps glass from wanting to stick to silver. So it's why when you're soldering, you either have to use fine silver or you have to bring up the silver to the surface of what you're putting your enamel down on, either
Okay,
pure
'cause I
copper
think I
or
have some of that.
silver.
That's why I was wondering. Because
Yeah.
my aunt used to do uh, stained glass, and I inherited some, and I didn't know what to do with it.
It won't be for stained glass. Stained glass
Not
is going to
stained
have
glass,
softer solders.
enameling.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, if she was doing enameling, it's very likely she had IT.
So I
Just
use,
know
like,
that
I use solder, just
it
like
is
this,
solder.
like,
It's just so close to Stirling melt temperature that you want to practice on something you don't care about getting it to flow. In fact, that's a
okay.
good thing for all of you guys to practice, or if you ever if you ever have a piece of solder that you're like, oh, I lost my little bend in it. I don't know what this solder is. You take a copper plate, piece of copper that you don't care about, and you put pieces of solder that you know what they are, and then you put the mystery solder, or in this case, your IT solder, and the things that you know, and get them to all flow, like bring the copper up to temp and watch the differential in how they flow. It'll teach you a lot about how solder works.
Mhm.
Okay?
Okay.
Or you can even go a step further and put little like pieces of tubing on the sheet and see how they solder down with each of the different solders.
Mhm.
It's a great practice exercise. Other questions? Other topics? Okay. I am going to be doing the majority of these hinges, hopefully, between now and our next session. I say that tenuously because I'm not sure of my schedule between now and then because I've got a show to prep for. Um, so you'll either come back to me doing a bunch of hinges with you or one or two hinges left on the project. We'll see. Um, and then the other thing is that I've been thinking ahead to what is the next thing I show you guys on screen. We certainly have another couple steps on this one in that I've got to finish putting it together. I've got to do a lot of cleanup on it. I've got to figure out where I'm putting the films that I'm going to be putting in and then polish it up. This one, you guys convinced me I probably should not add mokume on top of all the other things. So I won't be doing any of that. Um, but my box of unfinished things is actually getting emptier than I thought. So are there any other specific types of projects that you guys wanted to see. And I can pick and choose.
Hmm.
Can we
A
get some more
book
time?
or just in general?
More time to think about what you want to see?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not committing for the next session.
The 12th
I
of
just,
March is the next session, right?
oh yeah, the 12th of March. Is that right? Where did I put it? I know I put it in my list. Huh. Yes, March 12th instead of March 19th. I'll send out a general email after. I didn't want to send it before this session so I wouldn't confuse people. But yeah, it'll be same bat time. It's just gonna be a different bat day. Um, so I'll send the usual reminder emails a day or two before. I also, because we started out kind of slow at the beginning, I forgot to mention that I have locked in a bunch of both in-person and virtual classes, which I am posting the list here of ones that I have locked in. I'm hoping to get at least one more with Metalworks as a virtual class. However, now through the end of February, if you use the VIRTW WKSP25 code to sign up for either of the two virtual classes that I'm running myself, you get a 15% off discount for registering with that code. Again, that's only good
Oh,
for the two virtual classes.
where's that code?
In the chat, if you look in the chat. And if you guys aren't signed up for my mailing list, I also send it out in my mailing list when I do something like that. So it should be in that. Good through the end of the month. And that's I'm doing a 3-day virtual hollowforms class in June and a 3-day virtual clasps class in October. And those are the two that discount will work for. I can't give you discounts on the ones I do for schools. So my others are in person. There's going to be an in-person 2-day in Portland on Clasp. There's going to be another one in the fall that's going to be 2 specialty clasps.
That March
That was
29th to 30th, that website is now opening up.
huh. Uh, it should be going to. Let me share screen with you. I wonder, did you copy it or did you just try clicking on it? Because when I click on it, it
I
actually
just tried
gets.
clicking on it, but I'll copy it and see if that works.
So it should bring you to this, which is for registering for in-person. This is an only in-person workshop in Brookfield, Connecticut.
Okay.
And then the other in-person that I'm scheduled for is, where's my Zoom chat? The other in-person that I'm scheduled for is oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that one's in Connecticut. And then the other one is a few weeks later, I'm doing a clasps class in Portland at a new studio that the Creative Metal Arts Guild is putting together. So I'll be one of the first instructors into their new space. And then there's going to be a follow-up clasps class with more advanced clasps in the fall in Portland as well. And I do not yet know what I'll be teaching for if I do Metalworks. Oops, share. I can't tell. Are you guys seeing my screen still or no? Or are you not seeing my screen at all?
We see it.
Yes.
You're seeing Zoom is behaving badly all of a sudden. Let me make sure.
We see your screen.
You're
Yes.
seeing my face or you're seeing
Both.
Cradled in
Your
Style.
screen.
Okay, good. I can't see that that screen properly, so let me see what am I doing wrong. Where is my actual Zoom? Goodness, what are you doing to me, Zoom? Stop share. There we go. Shoo. Okay. And let's see, did I forget any notices? And then if you're in the greater Boston area, March 21st through 23rd, I'm doing the Paradise City Marlborough show. And if you're in the Portland area between April 25th and April 27th, I am doing the Gathering of the Guilds, which is an amazing show if you've never been. This year it's 9 guilds of different types of guilds from around the greater Pacific Northwest. And it's done in sections, so you can just walk the metals section or just walk the ceramics or the glass or the beads. We've added blacksmithing and calligraphy and something else this year, sculpture. So it's a super cool layout at like 350 artists in this ginormous space in the Oregon Convention Center. And as always, if you haven't used your Rio for Schools code in a while, pasting that in chat and you can use that. And that's all I have for you today because those hinges are not happening tonight. Any other questions or any other show and tell that anybody has? All right, I will see you a week early on March 12th instead of March 19th. And I will post this when I get a block of time, probably after this weekend. So thanks, gang, and thanks for showing up.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Rachel.
Have a good week. Monday.